Let us begin our journey in a garden. Not just any garden, but a particular place in ancient Athens, a place that would become one of the most misunderstood locations in the entire history of philosophy. This garden belonged to a man named Epicurus. The year is approximately 307 before the Common Era. Athens, that great city of marble and thought, has seen better days. The golden age of Pericles is long past. The towering figures of Socrates and Plato have already departed this world. And now, in the quieter, more uncertain times that followed the death of Alexander the Great, a different kind of philosophy is about to emerge. Epicurus was born on the island of Samos, a beautiful place in the Aegean Sea, in the year 341 before the Common Era. His father, Neocles, was an Athenian citizen who had moved to Samos as part of a colonial settlement. We know that his father worked as a school teacher, and his mother, Carestorate, practiced a form of religious ritual as a priestess of sorts, going from house to house, performing purification ceremonies. Imagine the young Epicurus watching his mother move through the homes of neighbors, chanting prayers, making offerings to the gods. And perhaps, even then, he was beginning to form questions. Questions about what the gods truly wanted, if anything. Questions about fear and why people seem to live with so much of it. At the age of 14, as was customary for young students in the Greek world, Epicurus began his formal education in philosophy. His teacher was a man named Pamphilus, a Platonist. According to later accounts, the young Epicurus asked his teacher to explain a passage from the poet Hesiod, a passage about chaos, that first principle from which everything emerged. When Pamphilus could not adequately explain where chaos itself came from, Epicurus reportedly decided he would need to seek truth for himself. Whether this story is entirely accurate, we cannot say with absolute certainty. Ancient biographies often contain elements of legend designed to show the early genius of their subjects. But what we can say is that Epicurus did indeed become a philosopher, and one who would chart his own course, separate from the dominant schools of Plato and Aristotle. At 18, Epicurus travelled to Athens to complete his required military service. This was the year 323 before the Common Era, the very year that Alexander the Great died in distant Babylon. The world was changing. The great empire that Alexander had built was fracturing. Uncertainty was everywhere. After his military service, Epicurus rejoined his family, who had been forced to leave Samos due to political upheaval. They settled in Colophon on the coast of Asia Minor. It was here, and later in Mytilene and Lampsacus, that Epicurus began to teach. He gathered students, he refined his ideas, and slowly, carefully, he developed a philosophy that would offer something the world desperately needed: peace of mind. Around 307 before the Common Era, now in his mid-30s, Epicurus returned to Athens. He purchased a property, a house with a garden. And it was in this garden that he established his school. The garden, as it came to be known, was different from other philosophical schools of the time. The Academy of Plato was formal, aristocratic. The Lyceum of Aristotle was systematic, scientific. But the Garden of Epicurus was open. It welcomed not just freeborn Greek men, but women and even enslaved people. This was extraordinary for its time. Above the entrance to the garden, an inscription reportedly read, "Stranger, here you will do well to tarry. Here our highest good is pleasure." And already in this simple invitation, we can see the beginning of a great misunderstanding. Pleasure. That single word. It would define Epicurus's philosophy, and it would also doom it to centuries of misrepresentation. Because when we hear the word pleasure in our modern world, we tend to think of indulgence, of excess, of sensual gratification pursued without restraint. We think of feasting, of intoxication, of all manner of bodily delights. But this is not what Epicurus meant. Not at all. To understand what Epicurus truly taught, we must first understand the world he lived in. We must understand what troubled the people of his time. And more than anything else, what troubled them was fear. The ancient Greeks lived with fear as a constant companion. They feared the gods, who were capricious and often cruel. They feared death and the unknown realm that lay beyond. They feared poverty, disease, and the loss of reputation. They feared so very much. The traditional religion of the Greeks did little to ease these fears. The gods of Olympus demanded sacrifices and proper ritual. They punished those who offended them. And even if you lived a good life, even if you honored the gods properly, there was no guarantee of anything good waiting for you after death. The afterlife described by Homer was a dim, shadowy place where the dead drifted as pale ghosts, mourning their lost vitality. Philosophers before Epicurus had offered various solutions to these anxieties. Plato taught that the soul was immortal and that those who lived justly would be rewarded in the next life. Aristotle emphasized the cultivation of virtue and the life of the mind. The Stoics, who were roughly contemporary with Epicurus, taught that one should accept fate with courage and live according to reason. But Epicurus offered something different. He offered a philosophy that would remove fear at its root. He would show that the gods were not to be feared, that death was nothing to be afraid of, that pleasure, properly understood, was the highest good, and that this pleasure was available to anyone who understood how to achieve it. In the garden, Epicurus and his followers lived simply. They ate modest meals, mostly bread and water, with occasional vegetables and simple cheese. They did not seek wealth or political power. They did not chase after fame. Instead, they sought something more precious: tranquility. The Greek word for this tranquility is ataraxia. It means, roughly, freedom from worry or unperturbedness. And this ataraxia, this calm and peaceful state of mind, was the true goal of Epicurean philosophy. Epicurus himself lived a life that reflected his teachings. Ancient sources tell us that he suffered from poor health, including painful kidney stones. Yet despite his physical ailments, he maintained a cheerful disposition. In a letter written shortly before his death, he described being in great pain, but also experiencing joy from recalling pleasant conversations with friends. He never married, though this was not from any rejection of human connection. Rather, Epicurus taught that one should carefully consider whether marriage and family would contribute to one's tranquility. For some, it would. For others, it would bring worry and disturbance. The key was to know yourself and to choose accordingly. The friendships cultivated in the garden were, by all accounts, deep and genuine. Epicurus wrote extensively about friendship, considering it one of the greatest sources of pleasure in life. Not because friends could provide us with advantages or help us achieve our goals, but simply because sharing our lives with others we trust and care for brings joy. In the garden, the followers of Epicurus studied philosophy, of course, but they also simply lived. They talked, they shared meals, they enjoyed one another's company. They practiced, day by day, the art of living well. Epicurus was a prolific writer. Ancient sources report that he composed more than 300 works, making him one of the most productive authors of antiquity. He wrote treatises on physics, on epistemology, on ethics. He wrote letters to his students, offering guidance and clarification on difficult points. He summarized his teachings in short, memorable maxims that his followers could easily remember and apply. Tragically, almost all of these works have been lost. The great library of Alexandria, which may have housed many of his writings, was destroyed. The triumph of Christianity in the Roman world led to the suppression of pagan philosophies, and Epicureanism was particularly targeted. Why? Because it denied divine providence, the immortality of the soul, and the afterlife, all central tenets of Christian belief. What survives of Epicurus's own words is precious but fragmentary. We have 3 letters preserved by a later biographer named Diogenes Laertius, who wrote in the 3rd century of the Common Era. We have a collection of 40 maxims known as the Principal Doctrines. We have some scattered quotations preserved by other ancient authors. And we have the voice of a Roman poet. His name was Lucretius, and he lived in the 1st century before the Common Era, more than 200 years after Epicurus died. Lucretius composed a long philosophical poem called De Rerum Natura, On the Nature of Things. In this remarkable work, written in beautiful Latin verse, Lucretius presented the entire Epicurean system, the physics, the psychology, the ethics, all of it. We are fortunate that Lucretius's poem survived the medieval period, probably because it was written in elegant poetry and copied by scribes who appreciated its literary merit, even if they rejected its philosophy. And in the Renaissance, when the poem was rediscovered and widely read, it sparked a renewed interest in Epicureanism that would influence thinkers like Montaigne, Gassendi, and even Thomas Jefferson. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us return to the garden, to that quiet place where Epicurus taught. When Epicurus died in 270 before the Common Era, at the age of 71 or 72, he left careful instructions in his will. The garden was to continue. His followers were to gather there and remember him every year. Funds were set aside to ensure this could happen, and it did. For centuries, the garden continued. The school persisted for nearly 600 years, making it one of the longest-lasting philosophical schools in antiquity. Throughout the Hellenistic period and into the Roman era, people continued to find solace in Epicurus's teachings. In times of political chaos, in times of war and uncertainty, the philosophy of the garden offered a way to maintain inner peace. But always, there was that misunderstanding, that persistent, stubborn misrepresentation of what Epicureanism actually taught. Critics, both ancient and modern, have portrayed Epicurus as a teacher of self-indulgence. They have used the word Epicurean to mean someone who lives for sensual pleasure, who seeks out fine foods and luxurious experiences, who cares only for their own gratification. Even today, when we describe someone as having Epicurean tastes, we usually mean they enjoy expensive wines and gourmet meals. But this portrayal is almost entirely false. It is a caricature, a distortion, and it would have horrified Epicurus himself. So what did Epicurus actually teach? What did he mean by pleasure? What was the philosophy that brought peace to so many troubled minds? To answer these questions, we must go deeper. We must explore the foundations of Epicurean thought, starting with how Epicurus understood the nature of reality itself. We must examine his physics, his atoms and void. We must understand his view of the gods and of death. And only then, only when we have all these pieces in place, can we truly appreciate what Epicurean pleasure means. But that journey will take us through many quiet corridors of thought. And so, let us continue, gently, carefully, exploring this philosophy that promised to free humanity from its deepest fears. The garden awaits. Let us walk through its paths together. To understand Epicurus's ethics, his teachings about how to live well, we must first understand his physics. This might seem strange at first. What does the nature of matter have to do with how we should live our lives? But for Epicurus, everything was connected. His physics provided the foundation for his ethics. If we understand how the world truly works, he believed, we can free ourselves from the superstitions and fears that make us miserable. So let us begin with atoms. The Greek word is atomos, which means uncuttable or indivisible. The idea that matter is composed of tiny, indivisible particles was not original to Epicurus. He inherited this theory from earlier philosophers, particularly two men named Leucippus and Democritus, who had lived in the 5th and 4th centuries before the Common Era. Democritus, in particular, had developed a sophisticated atomic theory. He taught that everything in the universe consists of atoms moving through empty space, which he called the void. These atoms, he said, are eternal and unchangeable. They cannot be created or destroyed. They have different shapes and sizes, and by combining in various ways, they form all the objects we see around us. When Epicurus encountered this theory, probably during his studies as a young man, he recognized its profound implications. But he also saw that it needed refinement. And so, he took the atomism of Democritus and modified it, adding his own insights and correcting what he saw as problems. Let us imagine, if we will, the Epicurean universe. In the beginning, there was no beginning. The universe, according to Epicurus, is eternal. It has always existed and always will exist. There was no creator God who fashioned it from nothing. There was no cosmic designer who organized it according to a plan. Instead, there are only atoms and the void. Infinite atoms moving through infinite space, forever. These atoms, as if thinking aloud, Epicurus tells us, have certain basic properties. They have size, though they are far too small for human eyes to see. They have shape. Some are round, some angular, some hooked or barbed. They have weight or mass, which causes them to fall through the void. And they are solid, absolutely solid, with no empty space within them. The atoms move through the void, falling downward through infinite space. Now, you might ask, downward from what? In which direction? In an infinite universe, there is no absolute up or down. But Epicurus means something simpler. The atoms have weight, and weight causes motion, always in the same direction, which we can call downward for convenience. Now, if all atoms simply fell straight down through the void, parallel to one another and never deviating from their paths, nothing interesting would ever happen. The atoms would never collide, never combine, never form complex structures. There would be no worlds, no life, no us. And so, Epicurus introduced a crucial innovation to atomic theory. He proposed that atoms, as they fall through the void, occasionally swerve. The Latin word used by Lucretius is clinamen, meaning a slight inclination or deviation. At unpredictable times and places, an atom veers slightly from its path. Just a tiny bit, the smallest possible deviation. This swerve, this small random movement, has enormous consequences. When an atom swerves, it may collide with another atom. These atoms may bounce apart, or they may become entangled, their shapes hooking together. And as more atoms collide and combine, complex structures begin to form. Imagine, if you will, atoms accumulating over vast stretches of time. In some regions of the infinite void, atoms cluster together in great numbers. These accumulations eventually form worlds. Not just our world, but countless worlds, scattered throughout the infinite universe. Some of these worlds may be similar to ours, others may be utterly different. Our Earth, our Sun, our Moon, the stars we see in the night sky, all of these are temporary configurations of atoms. They came together, they exist for a time, and eventually they will disperse. The atoms will separate and fall back into the void, only to combine again, perhaps in some new form in some distant future. And the same is true of everything we see around us. the mountain in the distance, made of atoms arranged in patterns of rock and stone. The tree in the garden, its atoms organized in the intricate structures of wood and leaf. The animal walking past, its atoms forming flesh and bone, all in constant, subtle motion. And us, we too are made of atoms. Our bodies, according to Epicurus, are temporary assemblages of atoms that have come together in a particular configuration. Our flesh, our bones, our organs, all of these are atomic structures. And our soul, our consciousness, our thoughts and feelings, these too are atomic. This was a radical claim in Epicurus's time, and it remains striking even today. The soul, Epicurus taught, is not something separate from the body, not some immaterial essence that can exist independently. Rather, the soul is made of especially fine, subtle atoms, atoms that are small and smooth and fast-moving. These soul atoms are spread throughout the body, concentrated particularly in the chest region. The soul atoms interact with the body atoms, and from this interaction arises consciousness, sensation, thought, and feeling. When we see something, atoms from the object strike our eyes. When we feel pain, this is a disturbance in the arrangement of atoms in the affected part of our body, and this disturbance is communicated to the soul atoms. Everything we experience is ultimately a matter of atoms interacting. Now, what happens when we die? This is one of the most important questions in Epicurean philosophy, and Epicurus's answer is clear and unambiguous. When we die, the body ceases to function as an organized system. The atoms that compose it begin to disperse, and the same happens to the soul atoms. Without the body to contain them, they scatter into the void. The soul, being nothing more than a particular arrangement of atoms, cannot survive the death of the body. There is no afterlife. There is no realm of the dead. There is no judgment, no punishment, no reward. There is simply dispersal. The atoms that once formed you return to the great reservoir of matter, ready to combine in new ways. And this, Epicurus says, is why we should not fear death. His reasoning is simple, elegant, and has been repeated countless times over the centuries. He says, death is nothing to us, for when we exist, death is not present, and when death is present, we do not exist. Since we never actually experience being dead, there is nothing in death to fear. All the terrors that religions have taught about death, the punishments of the underworld, the angry gods waiting to judge us, the eternal torments, all of these are empty superstitions. They are false, and recognizing them as false frees us. But let us return for a moment to that atomic swerve, that clinamen, because this seemingly small detail in Epicurus's physics has important implications for his ethics. The swerve, Epicurus tells us, is random. It cannot be predicted. It has no cause. It simply happens. And this randomness, this element of pure chance in the motion of atoms, means that the universe is not deterministic. Earlier atomists, particularly Democritus, had believed that everything happens according to necessity. If we knew the position and motion of every atom in the universe, we could, in principle, predict everything that would happen in the future. There would be no freedom, no genuine choice, just the inexorable working out of atomic collisions. But Epicurus rejected this determinism. By introducing the swerve, he introduced an element of unpredictability into nature. And this unpredictability, he argued, makes room for free will. Our actions are not completely determined by prior causes. At the level of our soul atoms, there is a tiny space for spontaneous action, for genuine choice. Now, we must be careful here. Epicurus does not give us a complete theory of free will. He does not explain in detail how the atomic swerve in our soul atoms translates into the experience of making a choice. Later philosophers have pointed out various difficulties with this theory, but what matters for Epicurus is the ethical conclusion. If we have some degree of free will, then we are responsible for our actions. We can choose to live wisely or foolishly. We can choose to pursue true pleasure or chase after empty satisfactions. We can choose to free ourselves from fear. The physics of Epicurus also has implications for his view of the gods. Now, this is an area where Epicurus is often misunderstood. Some people think that Epicurus was an atheist, that he denied the existence of the gods altogether. But this is not accurate. Epicurus believed that the gods exist. However, his gods are very different from the gods of traditional Greek religion. The gods of Epicurus are not concerned with human affairs. They do not answer prayers. They do not punish the wicked or reward the virtuous. They do not send storms or plagues. They do not care about us. Where do these gods live? Not on Mount Olympus, certainly. Epicurus taught that the gods dwell in the spaces between the worlds, in regions called intermundia. There, far removed from the affairs of mortals, gods live lives of perfect bliss. They are made of extremely fine atoms, more refined even than the human soul. They are eternal, or at least extremely long-lived, and they are completely at peace. Why then do the gods exist at all in Epicurean philosophy? If they have no influence on our lives, why not simply deny their existence? Epicurus's answer seems to be that belief in gods is universal among humans, and this universal belief suggests that the gods really do exist. We receive images of them, thin films of atoms that travel from the gods to us, forming impressions in our minds. But the gods of Epicurus serve primarily as ethical models. They show us what perfect happiness looks like. They are free from all worry, all disturbance, all fear, and we should try to emulate them, not by praying to them or offering them sacrifices, but by cultivating in ourselves the same tranquility they enjoy. The practical implication of this theology is profound. We do not need to fear the gods. We do not need to spend our time and resources trying to appease them with elaborate rituals. We do not need to worry that they are watching us and judging our every action. The gods are simply there, remote, blessed, and entirely indifferent to human concerns. This was, as you might imagine, a controversial teaching. The Athenian state religion was built on the assumption that the gods cared about the city, that they rewarded piety and punished impiety. Epicurus's teaching undermined this entire system, yet he was careful never to openly mock the traditional religion. He participated in public religious festivals, at least outwardly. He was prudent. The physics of Epicurus, with its atoms and void, its random swerves and its indifferent gods, provided the foundation for everything else in his philosophy. It explained how the world works without recourse to divine intervention. It explained consciousness and thought without requiring an immaterial soul. It explained death as a natural and final end, with nothing to fear beyond it. And all of this was in service of ethics. Because once we understand that the universe is made of atoms, that the soul is mortal, that death is nothing, and that the gods do not concern themselves with us, we can begin to focus on what really matters. We can begin to ask, how should I live? What truly brings happiness? What is genuine pleasure? And to answer these questions, we must turn to the ethical teachings of Epicurus. We must explore what he meant by pleasure, and why the pursuit of pleasure, properly understood, is the path to a good and tranquil life. But first, perhaps it would be helpful to consider how Epicurus thought we come to know anything at all. How do we gain knowledge of atoms, of gods, of pleasure itself? What is the basis of Epicurean epistemology? According to Epicurus, all knowledge begins with sensation. When we see, hear, taste, touch, or smell something, we are receiving information about the world. This information comes to us through thin films of atoms, which Epicurus called eidola, or images. These films peel off from the surfaces of objects and travel through the air until they strike our sense organs. When these atomic films reach our eyes, they create the sensation of sight. When they reach our ears, properly vibrating the air, they create sound, and so on for all the senses. Now, Epicurus believed that our sensations are always true. By this, he meant that they accurately represent what is affecting our sense organs at that moment. If I see a tower in the distance and it appears round, that sensation is true. The atomic films reaching my eye at that moment really are arranged in a circular pattern. Of course, if I walk closer to the tower and discover it is actually square, that does not make my earlier sensation false. Both sensations were true reports of what was affecting my senses at different distances. Error arises, Epicurus taught, not from sensation itself, but from our judgments about sensation. If I jump to the conclusion that the tower is round based on my distant view without investigating further, that is where I make a mistake. Sensation itself is always reliable. It is our interpretation that can go wrong. This empiricist approach, this trust in the senses as the foundation of knowledge, was important for Epicurus's entire philosophy. It meant that we do not need to rely on abstract reasoning or divine revelation to understand the world. We simply need to observe carefully and think clearly about what our observations tell us. Beyond sensation, Epicurus identified two other criteria of truth. One he called preconceptions, or prolepsis in Greek. These are general concepts that we form through repeated exposure to similar sensations. When we see many individual horses, for instance, we form a general concept of horse that allows us to recognize new horses when we encounter them. These preconceptions serve as a kind of mental shorthand, allowing us to navigate the world efficiently. The third criterion is the feelings of pleasure and pain. These, Epicurus taught, are nature's way of telling us what to pursue and what to avoid. Just as sensation tells us about the external world, feeling tells us about our own good. When something brings pleasure, this is a sign that it is good for us. Something brings pain. This signals that it should be avoided. Of course, as if thinking aloud. As we discussed earlier, not all pleasures are truly good for us, and not all pains are truly bad. A rich dessert might bring immediate pleasure, but lead to future discomfort. Exercise might bring immediate pain, but contribute to long-term health and well-being. So we must use reason to distinguish between pleasures and pains that are genuinely beneficial and those that are misleading. But reason itself, Epicurus insisted, must be grounded in sensation and feeling. We cannot spin philosophical theories out of pure abstraction, divorced from experience. Any valid reasoning must ultimately trace back to what our senses and feelings tell us. This is why Epicurus was so critical of Plato and other philosophers who claim to have knowledge of transcendent realities beyond the physical world. How could they know about such things if all knowledge comes from sensation, and our senses tell us only about the physical, material world? This epistemological foundation, this insistence on grounding all knowledge in experience, gave Epicurean philosophy a practical, down-to-earth character. It was not concerned with abstract metaphysical puzzles or elaborate logical arguments. Rather, it focused on what we can actually observe and experience, and what this tells us about how to live well. And when we observe carefully, what do we discover about pleasure? What do our senses tell us about what is good and what is bad? Let us explore this question as we move into the heart of Epicurean ethics. The atoms continue their eternal dance. The worlds form and dissolve. And in the brief span of our existence, we seek to understand how best to live within this vast, indifferent cosmos. That understanding begins with pleasure. Pleasure, that controversial word, that misunderstood concept. Let us now examine what Epicurus truly meant when he said that pleasure is the highest good. The Greek word Epicurus used is hedoni, from which we derive our word hedonism. And indeed, Epicurus was a hedonist, but not in the way that word is commonly understood today. He did not teach that we should maximize sensory pleasure or indulge every appetite. Rather, he taught something far more subtle, far more profound. Epicurus began with an observation that seems, on its face, quite simple. From the moment of birth, he noted, all living creatures naturally seek pleasure and avoid pain. An infant, knowing nothing of philosophy or morality, naturally desires what feels good and recoils from what feels bad. This, Epicurus argued, shows us that pleasure is the natural good, the thing that nature itself tells us to pursue. But immediately, Epicurus made a crucial distinction. Not all pleasures are equal. Not all pleasures are worth pursuing. And this is where his philosophy diverges sharply from simple self-indulgence. Epicurus divided pleasures into two fundamental categories. The first he called kinetic pleasures. These are the pleasures of motion, of process, of activity. They are the pleasures we feel when we satisfy a desire. The pleasure of eating when hungry, the pleasure of drinking when thirsty, the pleasure of warming oneself by a fire when cold. Kinetic pleasures are real pleasures, Epicurus acknowledged. There is nothing wrong with them in themselves, but they have a particular character. They depend on the prior existence of a need or a lack. We only take pleasure in eating because we were first hungry. We only enjoy drinking because we were first thirsty. The pleasure arises from the process of filling an absence. The second category, Epicurus called catastematic pleasures. These are the pleasures of a settled state, of equilibrium, of peace. They are the pleasures we experience when we are free from pain and disturbance. The pleasure of simply being alive when our body is healthy. The pleasure of a mind at rest, free from anxiety and fear. And it is this second type of pleasure, the catastematic pleasure, that Epicurus identified as the highest good. The ultimate goal of life, he taught, is not to maximize the moments of eating, drinking, and sensory excitement. Rather, it is to achieve a stable condition of freedom from pain in the body and freedom from disturbance in the soul. The Greek terms for these two states are important. Freedom from bodily pain is Aponia. Freedom from mental disturbance is Ataraxia. And when we achieve both Aponia and Ataraxia together, we have reached the highest pleasure possible for a human being. This might seem at first like a rather negative definition of happiness. It is defined by the absence of bad things rather than the presence of good things. But Epicurus would reject this characterization. The absence of pain and disturbance, he would say, is not merely neutral. It is itself a positive pleasure. It is the pleasure of peace. Imagine, if you will, a moment when your body feels perfectly comfortable. You are neither too hot nor too cold. You are neither hungry nor overfull. You feel no aches, no pains, no discomfort of any kind. In that moment, there is a subtle pleasure simply in existing, in being alive in a body that is functioning as it should. Now imagine that your mind is equally at peace. You are not worried about the future. You are not plagued by regrets about the past. You harbour no fears, no anxieties, no grudges, no agitations of any kind. Your mind is calm, clear, present. And in that mental tranquility, there is profound pleasure. This, Epicurus taught, is the happiness that we should seek. And he insisted that this happiness is achievable. It does not require wealth. It does not require power or fame. It does not require extraordinary circumstances or rare good fortune. It requires only that we understand the nature of pleasure and pain, and that we live accordingly. Let us consider how Epicurus applied this understanding to practical questions of living. First, regarding bodily pleasures, Epicurus taught that the basic needs of the body are modest and easily satisfied. We need food, but we do not need gourmet delicacies. We need shelter, but we do not need a palace. We need clothing, but we do not need fine silks and jewels. In fact, Epicurus argued that pursuing luxury often leads away from pleasure rather than toward it. Consider an expensive meal, elaborately prepared with rare ingredients. Yes, it may provide more kinetic pleasure during the eating than a simple meal would, but the pursuit of such meals comes with costs. First, there is the literal financial cost, which may require us to work longer hours, to take on stresses, to compromise our tranquility in pursuit of money. Second, there is the cost of habituation. If we train ourselves to take pleasure only in expensive foods, we make ourselves dependent on them. When they are unavailable, we suffer. The person who has trained themselves to find pleasure in simple foods, on the other hand, is always able to be satisfied. They can enjoy a meal of bread and water, and when something more elaborate is available, they can appreciate it all the more. Their happiness is secure, not dependent on circumstances beyond their control. Epicurus himself lived this way. Ancient sources tell us that his regular diet consisted primarily of bread and water. Occasionally there would be vegetables or a bit of cheese. This was not because he practiced asceticism for its own sake. He was not trying to punish his body or mortify his flesh. Rather, he had simply found that such a diet was sufficient for Aponia, for freedom from bodily pain, and anything beyond sufficiency was unnecessary. There is a letter that survives, written by Epicurus, in which he asks a friend to send him a small pot of cheese. He says this is so that he can have a feast when he wishes. A pot of cheese. This was what Epicurus considered a feast. Not roasted meats, not imported wines, not elaborate pastries, just cheese. And yet he spoke of it with such simple anticipation. This attitude toward food and drink, Epicurus extended to other bodily pleasures as well. Regarding sex, for instance, Epicurus's position was nuanced. He did not condemn sexual pleasure as morally wrong, but he noted that sexual desire, if allowed to dominate one's life, often leads to disturbance rather than tranquility. The pursuit of sexual conquest, the anxieties of romantic relationships, the jealousies and heartbreaks that often accompany passionate love, all of these, Epicurus observed, tend to disturb ataraxia. And so, while he did not forbid sexual activity, he counseled that it should be approached with caution and moderation. Some later Epicureans, including apparently Epicurus himself, chose celibacy as the path that best preserved their tranquility. Others found that a stable, affectionate relationship with a partner contributed to their happiness. The key was to understand yourself and to choose the path that would best support your own peace of mind. What about wealth? Here again, Epicurus took a moderate position. He did not teach that poverty was good or that money was evil. Rather, he distinguished between different kinds of desires related to wealth. Some desires, he said, are natural and necessary. The desire for food, for water, for shelter, these are natural to the human organism, and they must be satisfied if we are to survive. And satisfying them brings us to Aponia, to freedom from bodily pain. Other desires are natural but not necessary. The desire for variety in our food, for instance, or the desire for comfortable rather than merely adequate shelter. These desires are understandable, and satisfying them can bring kinetic pleasure, but they are not necessary for our well-being. Finally, there are desires that are neither natural nor necessary. These are desires that come not from our nature, but from empty social conventions and false opinions. The desire for fame, for instance, or the desire for excessive wealth, or the desire for power over others. These unnecessary desires, Epicurus taught, are dangerous. They are essentially unlimited. There is no point at which they are truly satisfied. The person who seeks fame always wants more fame. The person who seeks wealth always wants more wealth. And in pursuing these insatiable desires, we make ourselves perpetually miserable. Epicurus tells us, and here we can almost hear the calm certainty in his voice, that natural desires have a natural limit. When we are hungry, we eat, and at some point we are full. When we are thirsty, we drink, and our thirst is quenched. But the desire for fame or excessive wealth has no natural limit. It can never be truly satisfied. And so, as if thinking aloud, the wise person recognizes which desires are necessary and which are not. They satisfy the necessary desires simply and efficiently. They may occasionally indulge the natural but unnecessary desires, if doing so causes no disturbance to their tranquility. And they entirely abandon the desires that are neither natural nor necessary, recognizing them as empty and destructive. This analysis of desires is one of the most practical and useful aspects of Epicurean philosophy. It provides a clear framework for making decisions about how to live. When faced with a choice, ask yourself, is this desire natural and necessary, natural but unnecessary, or neither natural nor necessary, and choose accordingly. But what about the pleasures of the mind? So far we have spoken primarily of bodily pleasures and pains. Yet Epicurus believed that mental pleasures and pains are actually more significant than physical ones. The body, Epicurus observed, experiences only present pain or pleasure. When your tooth aches, you feel the pain now. When you eat, you taste the flavor now. The body is confined to the immediate present. But the mind can range across time. It can remember past pleasures and pains. It can anticipate future ones. And this temporal range makes mental experience both more powerful and more dangerous than physical experience. Consider someone suffering from a serious illness. The physical pain they experience is certainly difficult, but often the mental anguish is worse. They worry about the future. Will I recover? Will I die? What will happen to my loved ones? They remember their past health with longing. They imagine all the things they will never do. The mind multiplies the suffering. Conversely, mental pleasures can far exceed bodily ones. The pleasure of recalling a happy memory, the pleasure of anticipating a gathering with friends, the pleasure of understanding a difficult concept or solving a complex problem, the pleasure of creating something beautiful. All of these mental pleasures can be profound and lasting. And here is where friendship enters the Epicurean picture. Epicurus wrote more enthusiastically about friendship than about almost your topic. He said that friendship is one of the greatest sources of pleasure in life. Not because friends are useful to us, though they may be. Not because friendship is morally admirable, though it is. But simply because sharing our life with others we trust and care for brings deep and constant pleasure. In the garden, friendships were central to the philosophical community. The members of the school were not just fellow students, but genuine friends. They shared meals, they talked philosophy, they supported one another in difficult times. And this network of friendship was itself a profound source of ataraxia. Why? Because true friendship provides security. When we have friends we trust completely, we know that we are not alone. We know that if we encounter difficulties, we will have support. And this knowledge, this sense of security, calms the mind and contributes to tranquility. But Epicurus also noted that we should be selective in our friendships. Not everyone is capable of true friendship. Some people are too unstable, too prone to create drama and disturbance. It is better to have a few genuine friends than many superficial acquaintances. Quality, not quantity. And we should cultivate friendships with those who share our philosophical understanding, or who are at least sympathetic to it. Because if we surround ourselves with people who have false beliefs about what matters in life, who are constantly chasing after wealth or fame or sensory indulgence, their attitudes and behaviors may disturb our own tranquility. This might seem somewhat isolated or exclusive, and indeed, the Epicurean community had something of the character of a retreat from the world. But Epicurus would say that this is not selfishness, it is wisdom. We cannot help others if we ourselves are disturbed. We cannot promote tranquility if we do not first possess it. So far, we have been exploring Epicurus's positive teachings about pleasure, but we must also consider his teachings about pain. Because for many people, the question is not how to increase pleasure, but how to cope with unavoidable pain. Epicurus himself, as we mentioned earlier, suffered from chronic health problems, including painful kidney stones. Yet ancient sources consistently describe him as maintaining a cheerful and calm disposition. How did he manage this? By applying his own philosophical principles. First, he recognized that not all physical pain is equally severe. Some pains are intense but brief. Others are mild but chronic. Intense pain rarely lasts long, he observed. If pain is truly unbearable, it will either soon abate or it will kill us. Either way, its duration is limited. And knowing this can help us endure it. Chronic pain, the sort that persists over months or years, is rarely so intense that we cannot bear it. If we are still alive and able to think, the pain cannot be truly unbearable. And we can offset even chronic pain through mental pleasures, through philosophy, through memory, through friendship. In that famous letter written near the end of his life, Epicurus describes being in severe pain from his illnesses. Yet, he says, this pain is counterbalanced by the joy he feels in remembering his philosophical discussions with friends. The mental pleasure outweighs the physical pain. This is not mere stoic endurance. Epicurus is not gritting his teeth and bearing the pain through sheer force of will. Rather, he is genuinely experiencing pleasure, mental pleasure that coexists with physical pain and makes life still worth living. And what about the fear of pain? Often, Epicurus noted, we suffer more from the anticipation of pain than from the pain itself. We lie awake worrying about a medical procedure, and the worry is worse than the brief discomfort of the procedure when it comes. We imagine catastrophic scenarios, and the mental anguish of imagination exceeds any actual suffering we experience. The solution is to train the mind to focus on the present. When there is no pain now, enjoy the absence of pain. Do not borrow future suffering by worrying about it. And when pain does come, deal with it as it is, not as we imagine it might become. This philosophy of pleasure and pain, so carefully articulated, so practical in its applications, was at the heart of Epicureanism. It was not a call to constant partying or sensory indulgence. It was not permission to pursue every whim and desire. It was, instead, a sober and thoughtful approach to living well within the constraints of our human nature. Pleasure, properly understood, is peace. It is the absence of needless suffering. It is the presence of simple satisfactions. It is the joy of friendship and understanding. It is a life lived thoughtfully, deliberately, with full awareness of what truly matters. And what truly matters, according to Epicurus, can be expressed quite simply. We need food, water, and shelter. We need freedom from unnecessary pain. We need friends. We need philosophy. Meaning, we need to understand the nature of reality so that we are not tormented by false beliefs and empty fears. Everything else, everything beyond these basics, is either unnecessary or actively harmful to our tranquility. The mansions and banquets, the public honors and political power, the intense romances and thrilling adventures. All of these may bring moments of kinetic pleasure, but they come at the cost of ataraxia. Better, much better, to live simply and peacefully in a garden with friends. Better to eat bread and water with a calm mind than to feast at a banquet while tormented by anxiety. Better to be unknown and tranquil than famous and disturbed. This was the wisdom that Epicurus offered to a troubled world, and for many, many people across the centuries, it was exactly what they needed to hear. In times of chaos, in times of uncertainty, in times of fear, the garden offered refuge. But having understood Epicurean pleasure, we must now consider how this philosophy was misunderstood. We must explore why Epicurus, who lived on bread and water, came to be associated with gluttony and excess. We must examine the false idea of the pleasure seeker. How does a philosophy of simple living and tranquility become associated with excessive indulgence? How does a teacher who ate bread and water become synonymous with lavish feasting? The story of how Epicureanism was misunderstood is a fascinating study in how ideas can be distorted over time. The misunderstanding began almost immediately, even during Epicurus's lifetime. Other philosophical schools, particularly the Stoics, were quick to attack Epicureanism, and their primary criticism was that the pursuit of pleasure, even if Epicurus defined pleasure in sophisticated ways, was fundamentally base and unworthy. The Stoics, who emerged as a school around the same time as Epicureanism, taught a very different philosophy. They emphasized virtue as the only true good. They taught that we should live according to reason and accept whatever fate brings us. They valued discipline, duty, and emotional control. And to them, a philosophy based on pleasure seemed vulgar. It did not matter that Epicurus defined pleasure as tranquility rather than sensory indulgence. It did not matter that he lived with extreme simplicity. The very fact that he made pleasure the highest good was, to the Stoics, philosophically objectionable. And so they attacked. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus, who lived several centuries after Epicurus, characterized Epicureans as pleasure seekers who lived only for the body. He portrayed them as lacking moral fiber, as unable to face hardship with courage. This characterization stuck, even though it was fundamentally unfair. Another early critic was Cicero, the great Roman orator and philosopher. Cicero, who lived in the 1st century before the Common Era, wrote extensively about philosophy and included many criticisms of Epicureanism in his works. He argued that a philosophy based on pleasure could not provide an adequate foundation for morality or for political life. Cicero granted that Epicurus himself lived virtuously. But, Cicero argued, this was inconsistent with Epicurean principles. If pleasure is the highest good, why not pursue sensory pleasures? Why live simply? Cicero suggested that Epicurus was better than his own philosophy, that he practiced virtue despite his hedonistic principles rather than because of them. This line of criticism, that Epicureanism cannot account for virtue or morality, would be repeated again and again, and it contains a grain of truth. Epicurus did reduce all value to pleasure and pain. He did argue that we should be just and honest, not for their own sake, but because justice and honesty contribute to tranquility. But is this really a flaw? Epicurus would argue that it is simply honest. Most people, he would say, are virtuous because virtue makes their lives go better, not because of some abstract moral principle. The person who is dishonest may gain short-term advantages, but they will live in constant fear of being discovered. The person who harms others will make enemies, and destroy their own peace of mind. So virtue, properly understood, is in our self-interest because it contributes to the ultimate goal of tranquility. Critics found this explanation unsatisfying. They wanted morality to be based on something higher than self-interest, even enlightened self-interest. They wanted virtue to be good in itself, regardless of its consequences for our happiness. And so they continued to attack Epicureanism as inadequate. But the most damaging misrepresentation of Epicureanism came not from philosophical critics, but from the popular imagination. The very word pleasure carried connotations that Epicurus could not entirely control. When ordinary people heard that the Epicureans taught pleasure as the highest good, they naturally imagined sensory pleasures: food, drink, sex, luxury. There were, apparently, some who called themselves Epicureans, but did not understand or follow the genuine teachings. These were people who used the philosophy as an excuse for self-indulgence. They would cite Epicurus's teaching about pleasure and then proceed to live lives of excess, completely ignoring his careful distinctions and his emphasis on moderation. These pseudo-Epicureans, few though they may have been, damaged the reputation of the school. They provided evidence that critics could point to and say, "See, this is what Epicureanism leads to." Never mind that genuine Epicureans would have rejected such behavior as contrary to true philosophy. The rise of Christianity, beginning in the 1st century of the Common Era and becoming dominant in the 4th century, marked a turning point in the reception of Epicureanism. Christian theology and Epicurean philosophy were fundamentally incompatible on almost every important point. Christianity taught that God created the world and governs it with providence. Epicureanism taught that the world arose from the random collision of atoms, and that the gods, if they exist, do not concern themselves with human affairs. Christianity taught that the soul is immortal and faces judgment after death. Epicureanism taught that the soul is mortal and disperses at death. Christianity taught that we should live according to God's will and seek eternal salvation. Epicureanism taught that we should seek tranquility in this life and that death is nothing to fear. Given these deep conflicts, Christian writers were uniformly hostile to Epicureanism. Fathers of the early church like Lactantius, Tertullian, and Augustine attacked Epicurean philosophy as atheistic, materialistic, and morally corrupt. They portrayed Epicurus as an enemy of true religion and a corrupter of morals. Some Christian writers, particularly those influenced by Stoicism, did acknowledge that Epicurus himself lived virtuously, but they treated this as an inconsistency, arguing that his life contradicted his teaching. And they warned Christians to avoid Epicurean ideas as dangerous and ungodly. As Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, Epicureanism faced institutional suppression. Pagan philosophical schools were closed. Works of Epicurean philosophy were not copied or preserved. While Christian monasteries preserved the writings of Plato and Aristotle, which could be adapted to Christian purposes, they had no interest in preserving Epicurus. This is why, as we mentioned earlier, almost all of Epicurus's own writings were lost. The letters and maxims that survive do so almost by accident. And Lucretius's great poem, On the Nature of Things, survived the medieval period by the narrowest of margins, a single manuscript copy rediscovered in the 15th century. During the medieval period in Europe, Epicureanism was known primarily through the writings of its critics. Medieval scholars read about Epicurus in Cicero, in Augustine, in various encyclopedic works that summarized ancient philosophies. And the picture they got was overwhelmingly negative. Epicurus was the arch-materialist, the denier of providence, the advocate of pleasure-seeking. The word epicure entered European languages, and it meant someone devoted to sensual pleasures, particularly those of eating and drinking. An epicure was a gourmet, a bon vivant, someone who lived for the next fine meal or bottle of wine. This usage persists to this day. When we say someone has Epicurean tastes, we mean they appreciate fine food and drink. When we call a meal Epicurean, we mean it is elaborate and luxurious. The name of Epicurus, who lived on bread and water, has become synonymous with the very kind of luxury he rejected. The Renaissance brought a revival of interest in ancient philosophy, including Epicureanism. The rediscovery of Lucretius's poem was a major intellectual event. In 1417, a humanist scholar named Poggio Bracciolini, while searching through monastery libraries in Germany, discovered a manuscript of De Rerum Natura. This single manuscript, copied in the 9th century and then apparently forgotten, was the sole surviving copy of Lucretius's masterwork. Poggio had the manuscript copied, and soon these copies were circulating among Italian humanists. The impact was profound. Scholars and thinkers began to read Epicurean ideas in something closer to their original form. They encountered the atomic theory, the critique of religious fear, the naturalistic explanation of the world. And some found these ideas not only intellectually stimulating, but personally liberating. The poem influenced artists like Botticelli, who painted a series of illustrations for a manuscript of Lucretius. It influenced philosophers like Giordano Bruno, who developed his own version of an infinite universe filled with countless worlds. It influenced scientists like Galileo, though he was cautious about acknowledging this dangerous influence. But the rehabilitation of Epicureanism faced significant obstacles. The Catholic Church viewed Epicurean philosophy with deep suspicion. The denial of divine providence, the mortality of the soul, the emphasis on pleasure, all of these teachings contradicted Christian doctrine. Those who embraced Epicureanism too openly risked charges of heresy. And so, many Renaissance thinkers who were attracted to Epicurean ideas had to present them carefully. They would emphasize the ethical teachings while downplaying the physics. They would argue that Epicurus was right about how to live, but wrong about the nature of the soul. They would try to separate the appealing parts of Epicureanism from the theologically dangerous parts. The French philosopher Pierre Gassendi, who lived in the 17th century, worked to rehabilitate Epicureanism. He argued that Epicurean atomism was compatible with Christianity if one simply added that God created the atoms. He emphasized the ethical teachings of Epicurus and tried to show that they led to virtue rather than vice. But even Gassendi, in his efforts to make Epicureanism respectable, had to constantly defend it against the charge of promoting sensual indulgence. The association between Epicureanism and pleasure-seeking was so deeply entrenched that it could not be easily dislodged. In the Enlightenment, some thinkers embraced Epicurean ideas more openly. Thomas Jefferson, third President of the United States, declared himself an Epicurean in a letter to a friend. He wrote, "I too am an Epicurean. I consider the genuine, not the imputed doctrines of Epicurus as containing everything rational in moral philosophy which Greece and Rome have left us." Note Jefferson's careful qualification, the genuine, not the imputed doctrines. Even he, an educated man who had read the sources, had to distinguish the real Epicurus from the false reputation. He knew that most people's understanding of Epicureanism was wrong, and he wanted to clarify that he embraced the genuine philosophy, not the distorted popular version. The utilitarian philosophers of the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, drew on Epicurean ideas in developing their ethical theory. Bentham's principle that we should maximize pleasure and minimize pain owes a clear debt to Epicurus. Mill explicitly compared his own view to Epicureanism, but Mill also felt the need to defend Epicureanism against misrepresentation. In his famous essay, Utilitarianism, Mill wrote, "The accusation supposes human beings to be capable of no pleasures except those of which swine are capable." He then went on to argue, much as Epicurus had done, that there are higher and lower pleasures, and that the higher pleasures of the mind are more valuable than the lower pleasures of the body. Mill may have thought he was defending utilitarianism, but he was also defending Epicurus. He was trying to correct the same misunderstanding that had plagued Epicureanism for 2,000 years. And yet the misunderstanding persisted. Why? Why has this particular misunderstanding been so resilient? Why, despite the efforts of scholars and philosophers across the centuries, does the name Epicurus still conjure images of feasting and indulgence rather than bread and water and simple friendship? Several factors contribute to this persistent distortion. First, there is the simple power of the word pleasure. In most contexts, when people speak of pleasure, they mean sensory pleasure. The pleasure of taste, of touch, of physical sensation. These are the most obvious and immediate forms of pleasure, and they are what most naturally come to mind. Epicurus's more subtle concept of pleasure as tranquility, as the absence of pain and disturbance, requires more explanation. It is not immediately intuitive. And in the absence of careful explanation, people naturally fall back on the more obvious meaning of the word. Second, there is a certain appeal in the idea of philosophical license for indulgence. People want to believe that a respected philosopher taught that pleasure-seeking is good. It validates their own desires. It provides intellectual cover for self-indulgence. And so the false version of Epicureanism persists because, in a way, people want it to be true. Third, the genuine Epicurean philosophy is actually quite demanding. It requires that we examine our desires carefully, that we distinguish between natural and necessary versus unnecessary desires. It requires that we practice moderation, that we cultivate friendships, that we study philosophy. It asks us to give up the pursuit of wealth, fame, and power. In short, it asks us to change our lives in fundamental ways. The false version of Epicureanism, by contrast, is easy. It simply says, pursue pleasure, enjoy yourself, do what feels good. This is a much more appealing message to most people, even if it is not what Epicurus actually taught. Fourth, and perhaps most fundamentally, there is a deep cultural suspicion of pleasure in many philosophical and religious traditions. The idea that pleasure could be the highest good strikes many people as simply wrong, as base, as unworthy of a human being. This suspicion has deep roots. Plato taught that the body and its pleasures distract us from higher realities. Christianity taught that the flesh is weak and that we should focus on spiritual rather than worldly concerns. Kant, in the 18th century, argued that acting from inclination, including the inclination toward pleasure, has no moral worth. Only acting from duty matters. Given this cultural context, any philosophy that makes pleasure central will be viewed with suspicion, and it becomes easy to assume the worst. If Epicurus says pleasure is the highest good, he must mean bodily pleasure. He must be advocating self-indulgence. There must be something wrong with the philosophy. And so, despite the explicit testimony of the sources, despite the clear evidence of Epicurus's own simple lifestyle, despite 2,000 years of scholars trying to correct the misunderstanding, the false idea of Epicurus as a pleasure seeker in the sensual sense persists. It persists in our language, where Epicurean means luxurious. It persists in popular culture, where references to Epicurus are usually jokes about indulgence. It persists in the minds of educated people who have heard the name Epicurus but never actually read his philosophy. And this is unfortunate. It is unfortunate because the genuine philosophy of Epicurus has much to offer. His careful analysis of desires and pleasures is psychologically sophisticated and practically useful. His emphasis on friendship as a source of happiness is both true and touching. His attempt to free people from the fear of death and the gods addresses real and persistent sources of human anxiety. Many people today, living in wealthy societies with abundant material goods, still struggle with happiness. They chase after success, wealth, status, and possessions, believing these will bring satisfaction. And yet, when they achieve these things, the satisfaction is fleeting. They remain anxious, unsettled, disturbed. Epicurus could tell them why. They are pursuing unnecessary desires. They are seeking kinetic pleasures that provide momentary satisfaction but never lasting peace. They are making their happiness dependent on things they cannot fully control. The opinions of others, the vagaries of markets, the uncertainties of fate. If they understood genuine Epicureanism, they might live differently. They might simplify their lives. They might invest more in relationships and less in possessions. They might find that happiness is more achievable than they thought, not because it requires great effort or good fortune, but because it requires only clarity of understanding and simplicity of living. But to receive this wisdom, they would first have to overcome the misunderstanding. They would have to see past the false Epicurus of popular imagination to the real Epicurus of the garden. They would have to understand that the philosophy of pleasure is, in reality, a philosophy of peace. And that brings us to our final section. Having explored the misunderstanding, we should now consider what Epicureanism can offer to us today. How can this ancient philosophy, so often misrepresented, speak to our contemporary concerns? What can we learn from that quiet garden in Athens 2,300 years ago? Let us conclude, gently, by reflecting on the lasting relevance of Epicurean wisdom. We have journeyed far, from a garden in ancient Athens, through the intricacies of atomic theory, through the subtle philosophy of pleasure and pain, through centuries of misunderstanding. And now we arrive at a question. Does Epicureanism still matter? In our modern world, we face anxieties that Epicurus could never have imagined. We worry about climate change, nuclear weapons, artificial intelligence. We face pressures from constant connectivity, from social media, from the relentless pace of technological change. We live in a world that would be utterly alien to the philosophers of ancient Athens. And yet, the fundamental human condition has not changed as much as we might think. We still experience pleasure and pain. We still desire security and companionship. We still fear death and uncertainty. We still struggle with the question of how to live well. And on this question, Epicurus still has wisdom to offer. Let us consider, first, the Epicurean analysis of desires. In a consumer society like ours, where advertising constantly creates new desires, and where our worth is often measured by what we own and consume, Epicurus's distinction between natural and necessary versus unnecessary desires is remarkably relevant. How much of what we want do we actually need? How much of our consumption is driven by genuine need, and how much by manufactured desire? The latest smartphone, the luxury car, the designer clothes, the expensive vacation, are these natural desires, or are they desires created by social pressure and marketing? Epicurus would invite us to examine these desires carefully. He would ask, will satisfying this desire bring lasting peace, or only momentary pleasure followed by new desire? Will it move me toward Ataraxia, or will it create new dependencies and anxieties? Is this something I truly need, or something I have been taught to want? This kind of examination, if practiced honestly, tends to reveal that much of what we pursue is unnecessary. We do not need the luxury items. We do not need to keep up with others. We do not need the social status that comes from conspicuous consumption. What we need is quite modest: adequate food, shelter, clothing, physical health to the extent we can maintain it, meaningful relationships, mental tranquility, and perhaps, though Epicurus would not put it quite this way, some sense of meaning or purpose in our lives. Everything beyond these basics, Epicurus would say, is extra. It may bring kinetic pleasure, and there is nothing wrong with that if it causes no harm. But we should not make our happiness depend on it. We should not structure our lives around the pursuit of the unnecessary. This philosophy has obvious implications for issues like consumer debt, which plagues many people in wealthy countries. People borrow money to finance lifestyles that exceed their means, purchasing things they do not need in pursuit of satisfactions that prove fleeting. Then they spend years burdened by debt, working longer hours to make payments, caught in a cycle that destroys tranquility. An Epicurean would simply not enter this cycle. They would distinguish between what is necessary and what is not. They would live within their means. They would find that freedom from debt brings more lasting satisfaction than any of the purchases that debt might finance. Consider also Epicurus's teaching about the gods and divine providence. While few today believe in the traditional Greek gods, many people do struggle with religious anxiety. They worry whether they are living according to God's will. They fear divine judgment. They are troubled by questions about theodicy. Why does a good God allow suffering? Epicurus cannot resolve all these questions, particularly for those with strong religious commitments. But he offers an alternative perspective. If we accept that divine beings, if they exist, are not concerned with human affairs, then we need not worry about pleasing them or fear offending them. We can focus on living well in this life, on human terms, according to human needs. For those who are not religious, or whose religious beliefs do not include a providential God, Epicurus's view can be liberating. It means we do not need to wonder why tragedy struck us specifically. There is no cosmic plan in which our suffering serves some inscrutable purpose. Things simply happen as the atoms collide and combine and disperse, and we must make the best of our circumstances, seeking tranquility where we can find it. This naturalistic worldview has gained considerable traction in modern times. The scientific revolution, the theory of evolution, modern physics and cosmology, all of these developments have painted a picture of a universe not unlike the Epicurean cosmos, a universe of matter in motion, governed by natural laws rather than divine intervention. Epicurus's atomism was, of course, largely wrong in its details. Atoms are not solid, indivisible particles, but are themselves composed of subatomic particles. The swerve of atoms does not explain free will in any satisfactory way. Epicurus knew nothing of chemistry, of molecules, of DNA, of the quantum realm, but his fundamental approach, his attempt to explain the world naturalistically without recourse to supernatural intervention, was sound. It was an early step on the path to modern science, and his ethical conclusions, drawn from his understanding of nature, do not depend on the precise accuracy of his physics. Now let us consider Epicurus's teaching about death. Death is nothing to us, he famously said. When we exist, death is not present. When death is present, we do not exist. Therefore, death is nothing to be feared. Does this argument succeed? Many philosophers have criticized it. They point out that we can rationally fear things that will happen when we no longer exist. I might fear that my death will cause suffering to my loved ones, or that my projects will remain unfinished, or that I will have lived a wasted life. None of these fears is about the state of being dead. They are about what my death means. Epicurus might reply that these are not fears of death itself, but fears about life. Fear that we have not made adequate provision for our loved ones. Fear that we have not accomplished what we hoped. And these fears, he might say, can be addressed in life. We can care for our loved ones. We can work on our projects. We can live meaningful lives. And having done so, we can face death without terror. There is something appealing in this view. Much of our anxiety about death comes from feeling that we have not lived well or fully. If we can address those concerns, if we can feel that we have lived according to our values and have done what matters most to us, then death becomes less frightening. It is simply the natural end of a life well lived. But Epicurus goes further. He argues that we should not desire immortality, should not wish to live forever. Why? Because life is not improved by being longer. If we have achieved Ataraxia, if we have lived tranquilly, then we have experienced the highest good available to us. Living longer does not make this any better. It is the quality of life that matters, not its duration. This is a striking claim, and one that many people would dispute. Most of us, if offered the chance to extend our lives indefinitely, would probably accept. We feel that there is always more to experience, more to learn, more to do. The idea that a good life could be complete, that we could reach a point where more years would add nothing, seems foreign to us. And yet, Epicurus has a point. If we are always craving more time, always feeling that life is insufficient, always anxious about its brevity, we will never be at peace. We will be constantly disturbed by the thought of mortality. But if we can accept that a finite life can be complete and satisfying, then we can be at peace with our mortality. This acceptance does not mean resignation or despair. It does not mean giving up or ceasing to value life. Rather, it means appreciating the life we have without being tormented by its limitations. It means living fully in the present, rather than always anxiously grasping for more future. Let us consider friendship, another central theme in Epicurean philosophy. In our hyper-connected modern world, where we have hundreds of friends on social media, but often feel isolated and lonely, Epicurus's emphasis on genuine, deep friendship is powerfully relevant. Epicurus distinguished between true friends and mere associates or useful connections. True friends are those with whom we can be completely honest, who support us not for what we can do for them, but simply because they care. True friendship requires time, attention, and vulnerability. It cannot be superficial. In the garden, friendships were cultivated through daily interaction, through shared meals and conversations, through mutual study of philosophy. The members of the community knew each other deeply. They had shared commitments and values, and this created bonds of extraordinary strength. Modern research in psychology confirms what Epicurus intuited. Deep social connections are one of the strongest predictors of happiness and well-being. Loneliness, conversely, is associated with poor mental and even physical health. We are social creatures, and we need meaningful relationships to thrive. But modern life often works against deep friendship. We are geographically mobile, moving for jobs or other opportunities. We are busy, working long hours and maintaining packed schedules. We interact with many people casually, but have little time for deep connection. And we often substitute digital communication for face-to-face interaction. An Epicurean approach would counsel us to prioritize friendship much more highly. It would suggest that we arrange our lives to the extent possible to allow for deep relationships. This might mean staying in one place longer, even if career opportunities elsewhere might pay more. It might mean working less and earning less in order to have more time for friends. It might mean being selective about commitments so that we have energy for the relationships that matter most. This is not easy in our economy and culture, but Epicurus would say that the tranquility gained from true friendship is worth more than the additional wealth or status we might gain by sacrificing it. And he would probably be right. Consider also the Epicurean view of pleasure and happiness. In a culture obsessed with maximizing pleasure, with constant entertainment and stimulation, with life hacking and optimization, Epicurus's calm insistence that the highest pleasure is simply the absence of pain and disturbance seems almost revolutionary. We are taught, implicitly, if not explicitly, that happiness means excitement, novelty, achievement, accumulation. We measure our lives in experiences collected, in goals achieved, in things acquired. We feel that we should be constantly improving, constantly growing, constantly doing more. Epicurus would find this exhausting. He would ask, when do you rest? When are you satisfied? When is enough enough? If you are always striving for more, always chasing the next goal or experience, you can never be at peace. You will always be disturbed by desire and ambition. The Epicurean alternative, as if thinking aloud, is to find satisfaction in sufficiency, to have enough, to be enough, to cultivate the ability to take pleasure in simple things, a walk in nature, a conversation with a friend, a meal shared, a quiet evening with a book. To recognize that these simple pleasures, when appreciated fully, are not inferior to more elaborate ones. They are simply pleasure. This is not about settling for less or lowering our ambitions. It is about understanding what truly contributes to well-being. And research in positive psychology suggests that Epicurus was onto something. Beyond a certain baseline level of material security, increases in wealth have surprisingly little effect on happiness. What matters much more is the quality of our relationships, our sense of purpose, our physical health, and our mental state. If this is true, then an Epicurean approach, focusing on sufficiency rather than accumulation, on tranquility rather than excitement, on depth rather than breadth, might actually be more conducive to happiness than the dominant cultural model. Of course, we cannot simply transplant ancient Epicureanism into the modern world without modification. The world has changed too much. We face ethical questions that Epicurus never considered. We live in complex societies that require engagement, not withdrawal to a garden. We have knowledge that Epicurus lacked, and face problems he could not have imagined. But the fundamental insights of Epicureanism, the careful analysis of desires, the emphasis on tranquility, the value of friendship, the acceptance of mortality, the naturalistic worldview, these remain relevant. They can guide us if we let them. Perhaps what we need is not to become Epicureans in the strict sense, withdrawing from society and living on bread and water. But we might benefit from becoming more Epicurean in our approach to life, more thoughtful about our desires, more focused on tranquility, more appreciative of simple pleasures, more invested in deep friendships, less driven by anxiety and ambition, more content with sufficiency. This is the wisdom that has survived 2 millennia of misunderstanding. This is what Epicurus, that quiet philosopher in his garden, has to offer us. Not permission for indulgence, not license for hedonism, but guidance toward a life of peace. Let us consider one final application of Epicurean wisdom to contemporary life. In our age of information overload, of constant news cycles and social media feeds, We are perpetually bombarded with information about threats, dangers, problems, and crises. Much of this information is designed to provoke anxiety, to capture our attention through fear. Epicurus would counsel us, as if thinking aloud, to carefully consider which of these threats are truly relevant to our lives and which are not. Is this something that directly affects my well-being or that of those I care about? Is this something I can actually do anything about? Or is this simply noise, disturbing my tranquility without providing any benefit? The Epicurean approach would not mean ignoring genuine problems or refusing to be informed about the world. Rather, it would mean being selective and intentional about what information we consume. It would mean protecting our mental peace from the constant assault of anxiety-provoking content that serves no useful purpose. Similarly, Epicurus would have thoughts about our contemporary culture of achievement and constant self-improvement. We are told we should always be working on ourselves, always becoming better, always pursuing the next goal or milestone. There is always another promotion to seek, another skill to learn, another achievement to unlock. But when is enough enough? Epicurus would ask us to consider whether this constant striving truly contributes to our tranquility, or whether it keeps us in a perpetual state of dissatisfaction. Perhaps, he might suggest, there is value in simply being content with who we are and what we have achieved. Not complacent, not stagnant, but satisfied. This does not mean abandoning all goals or ceasing to grow. Rather, it means distinguishing between goals that genuinely matter to us, that align with our values and contribute to our well-being, and goals we pursue simply because we feel we should, because others expect it, because the culture demands constant achievement. The garden is still there, in a sense. Not as a physical place in Athens that is long gone, but as an idea, as an approach to living. We can each cultivate our own garden, literal or metaphorical. We can gather friends and share simple meals. We can study, we can think, we can talk. We can practice the art of living well. In a world that often seems designed to disturb our peace, that constantly creates new anxieties and desires, that measures our worth by what we produce and consume, the Epicurean alternative offers something quietly radical. It offers permission to step back, to live more simply, to find satisfaction in sufficiency. And perhaps most importantly, it offers a way of thinking about death that neither denies its reality nor allows it to poison our present existence. Death will come, yes, but that is no reason to live in fear. Rather, the certainty of death gives urgency and meaning to the life we have now. It reminds us not to waste our time on unnecessary pursuits, not to sacrifice present peace for future goals that may never materialize. The atoms that compose us, Epicurus would remind us, were not always us and will not always be us. They came together for a brief time in this particular configuration, and that configuration happens to be conscious, to think and feel and experience. How remarkable, how precious, and how important then to make the most of this brief moment of consciousness, not by cramming in as much experience as possible, but by cultivating peace and appreciation. The garden is still there, in a sense, not as a physical place in Athens, that is long gone, but as an idea, as an approach to living. We can each cultivate our own garden, literal or metaphorical. We can gather friends and share simple meals. We can study, we can think, we can talk. We can practice the art of living well. And in doing so, we honor the memory of Epicurus, not the false Epicurus of popular imagination, but the real one, the philosopher who sought to free humanity from fear, the teacher who showed that happiness is simpler than we think, the friend who lived and taught that pleasure, properly understood, is peace. The atoms continue their eternal dance. The universe unfolds according to natural law. And in the brief moment of our existence, we have the opportunity to live well, to seek tranquility, to cultivate friendship, to appreciate the simple fact of being alive, free from unnecessary pain and disturbance. This is the philosophy of Epicurus. Not exciting, perhaps, not dramatic, but true and helpful and kind. A philosophy for those who are tired of the race, who want to step off the treadmill, who seek something more sustainable than constant striving. The garden welcomes all who understand. The path to tranquility is open, and the wisdom of Epicurus, preserved through centuries of misunderstanding, waits patiently for those ready to receive it. Let us rest now in that knowledge. The questions remain, but for now they can wait. The philosophy is there when we need it, the insights endure, and in the quiet moments when we turn away from the noise and bustle of modern life, we can still hear, faintly, the voice of that ancient teacher. Pleasure is the beginning and end of living happily, he said. But the pleasure he meant was peace. And peace is still available, still achievable, still worth seeking. And so our journey through Epicurean philosophy draws to a close. We have walked through the garden, examined the atoms, understood the gods, clarified the pleasures, confronted the misunderstandings, and found the lasting wisdom. What more is there to say? Perhaps only this, that the good life, the happy life, the peaceful life, is not as far away as we fear. It does not require great fortune or exceptional circumstances. It requires only understanding and the courage to live according to that understanding. Epicurus offers us that understanding, and for that, we can be grateful. The night deepens, the thoughts settle, and in the silence, there is peace. Rest well.